The genomic report just hit my inbox. 100% DNA match to a corpse. My parents froze my accounts while I was still staring at the screen. Now tactical teams are kicking down my door, and the only thing between me and them is a fire escape and a stolen tablet labeled Resurrection Project. They didn't just lie to me. They own me. I'm one floor above them, lungs burning, fingers flying over the tablet's encrypted files. The truth is in here. So is my death warrant. The pixelated columns on the monitor pulsed a rhythmic neon green against the dimness of the studio. Ethan Miller gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, splinters digging into his palms. The genomic report lay between his elbows, the paper crisp and smelling of ozone. According to the sequencing, his double helix mirrored a man buried in 1954. Every base pair, every genetic marker, an impossible reflection of a ghost. His fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, clicking like hailstones on a tin roof. He bypassed the security layers of Gentek's secure system, moving past the digital gates until a single file flickered into view. Project Lazarus. Ethan's pulse thudded in his throat. He leaned closer, the heat from the monitor warming his face. The data was undeniable. He wasn't just a descendant, he was a copy, a biological forgery. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards. He slid toward the window, peeling back the heavy velvet curtain. Rain streaked the glass in jagged lines, blurring the streetlights of the Brooklyn neighborhood below. 3 black sedans idled at the curb, their headlights cutting through the fog like predatory eyes. Men in charcoal overcoats stepped onto the pavement, their movements synchronized and silent. One agent pressed a hand to his earpiece, eyes scanning the third-floor balcony where Ethan stood frozen. Ethan's breath hitched, fogging the glass. The apartment, once a sanctuary of leather-bound books and warm lamplight, now resembled a stage set, a fragile illusion of a life he never truly owned. He reached for his birth certificate in the desk drawer. The parchment seemed too yellow, the ink too precise, the signatures of the doctors too clean. He existed as a reconstruction, a piece of biological software built upon a corpse. He felt a sudden, sharp chill. If the DNA matched a dead man, who was Ethan Miller? The door buzzer shrieked, a piercing metallic wail that made him flinch. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Ethan, open up." Chloe's voice muffled through the wood, sharp and frantic. He didn't move. He watched the men on the street begin to move toward the front entrance of the brownstone. "Ethan, it's Chloe, please." He crossed the room, his boots thudding on the hardwood. He counted the steps instinctively. 1, 2, 3. He reached the door and threw the bolt. Chloe Adams stumbled inside, her blonde hair damp from the rain, her cheeks flushed a frantic red. She didn't wait for him to speak. She gripped his forearms, her fingers cold and trembling. "The Millers, Thomas and Eleanor. They've done something, Ethan. I tried to use the card at the grocery store, and it was declined. I checked the app. Your accounts, they're gone. Wiped clean. Every credit, every cent. It's like you don't exist to the bank anymore." Ethan stared at her, the scent of her damp wool coat mixing with the ozone of the computer. He looked back at the screen where the genomic report still glowed. The financial isolation was the first step in a harvest. His parents, the people who had raised him in that cold, sterile mansion in the Hudson Valley, hadn't just cut him off. They were revoking his lease on life. "They're downstairs, Chloe," Ethan whispered, his voice sounding thin and hollow in the quiet room. "The black sedans. They aren't here to talk about the money." Chloe's eyes widened, her gaze darting to the window. "What are you talking about?" Why would your father send security teams? Because I'm not his son, Ethan said, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. I'm an asset. A project. He turned back to the desk, his mind racing through the logic of escape. He needed the data. He reached for a rugged, black external drive, the metal casing cold against his palm. He began moving the files, the Project Lazarus folders, the sequencing maps, the encrypted logs. The status bar on the screen crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Outside the door, the hallway groaned. Heavy footsteps, the rhythmic thud of combat boots, approached. Ethan knew the count of the stairs in this building by heart. 24 steps to the landing. He heard the 23rd step creak. We have to go, now, Ethan hissed. He yanked the drive from the port the moment the light turned solid green. He shoved it into his lead-lined pouch, the heavy fabric crinkling. The door handle rattled, then the wood groaned under the weight of a shoulder. A heavy thud shook the frame. Ethan didn't wait for the second strike. He grabbed his jacket and lunged for the window leading to the fire escape. "Ethan, wait!" Chloe cried, but he was already shoving the window upward. The frame resisted, stuck with years of grit and paint, until it gave way, with a screech of wood on wood. Cold rain lashed his face as he stepped onto the rusted iron grate. He looked down into the dark abyss of the alleyway. The iron felt slick and treacherous under his boots. He started the descent, his voice a low, frantic whisper in the wind. 1, 2, 3, 4. He reached the first landing just as the door to his apartment shattered inward. The sound of splintering oak echoed in the narrow alley. A beam of white light cut through the darkness from above, sweeping across the brickwork. "He's on the ladder," a voice barked, a harsh military command that lacked any hint of hesitation. Ethan scrambled down the next flight, his hands stinging as they gripped the cold, wet metal rails. He reached the drop ladder, the final segment that would take him to the pavement. He kicked the release lever, but the ladder didn't slide. He kicked it again, harder, the metal clanging loudly. He looked up. A man in tactical gear was leaning over the railing of the third-floor landing, silhouetted against the amber light of the apartment. The man didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a small black cylinder. Ethan lunged for the ladder one more time, throwing his entire weight onto the release. This time, it plummeted, the screech of metal on metal piercing the night. He slid down the rungs, the friction burning his palms through his sleeves. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his teeth. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw something glinting in the trash near the ladder. It was a tablet dropped by one of the men who had been guarding the perimeter below. Ethan snatched it up, the plastic casing wet and grimy. He didn't have time to check it. He bolted toward the mouth of the alley, his lungs burning with the scent of wet asphalt and fear. He didn't look back for Chloe. He couldn't. The logic of the system dictated that any attachment was a vulnerability. He turned the corner onto the main street, blending into the shadows of a closed laundromat. He waited, pressed against the cold brick, his heart a frantic drumbeat. He pulled the stolen tablet from his pocket. The screen flickered to life, bypassed by the fact that the agent hadn't locked it yet. A list of names scrolled past, headlined by a title that made the world tilt on its axis. The Resurrection Project. Phase 4. Implementation. At the top of the list was his own name. Below it, a series of dates. The most recent date was today. The next was 72 hours from now. It was labeled Final Imprinting / Consciousness Overwrite. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. He looked at the bottom of the screen. The digital signature for the authorization wasn't a government agency or a medical board. It was a logo he had seen every day of his childhood, the interlocking M of Miller Global Holdings. His father hadn't just built a company, he had built a son, and now he was coming to collect the hardware. Ethan moved deeper into the city, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the cameras perched like vultures on every pole. He found himself in the industrial district near the docks, a place of rusted shipping containers and the smell of salt and diesel. He found a crawl space beneath a derelict warehouse, the air inside thick with the scent of damp earth and old grease. He sat in the dark, the stolen tablet the only source of light. He began to dig. He used his knowledge of the Miller Global Internal Architecture, a system he himself had helped optimize, to find the back doors. He bypassed the security nodes, navigating the digital labyrinth until he found the ownership records for Gentech, the lab that had sent him the genomic report. The deeper he went, the colder he felt. Every shell company, every holding group, led back to the same source. His father's firm owned the lab. They owned the database. They owned the very sequence of his DNA. A realization hit him, sharper than the cold. The genomic report hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a leak. It was a notification, a countdown. He leaned his head against the damp concrete wall, closing his eyes. He started to count. 1, 2, 3. But for the first time in his life, the numbers didn't make him feel safe. They felt like seconds ticking off a bomb. The next morning, the city felt different. The sunlight was too bright, the noise of the traffic too aggressive. Ethan moved through the crowds in a daze, his clothes wrinkled and smelling of the warehouse floor. He needed a place to think, a place where the air was still and the variables were controlled. He found himself at the doors of the New York Public Library. The massive stone lions stood guard, indifferent to his existential collapse. He climbed the steps, 38 of them, and entered the great hall. The smell of old paper and floor wax acted as a temporary balm to his frayed nerves. He sat at a long oak table in the back of the stacks, the stolen tablet hidden beneath a stack of oversized history books. He opened a file labeled Imprinting Protocols. As he read, the text began to blur. A strange sensation washed over him, a wave of heat that started at the base of his skull and radiated outward. The library, with its hushed whispers and scratching pens, seemed to recede. The providence of the soul is not found in the flesh, but in the echoes of the word. Ethan whispered. He froze. Those weren't his words. The cadence was wrong. The vocabulary was archaic, the vowels elongated in a way that felt heavy in his mouth. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt tight. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, but not with fear. It was a rhythmic, purposeful twitch. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to move, to do something with his fingers. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. A librarian glanced over, pushing her glasses up her nose. Ethan didn't see her. He walked toward the center of the hall, where a grand piano sat on a small dais, reserved for evening recitals. He sat on the bench. He had never taken a piano lesson in his life. He didn't know a sharp from a flat. But as his hands hovered over the ivory keys, he didn't hesitate. He began to play. The music was haunting, a complex, mournful dirge from another era. His fingers moved with a virtuoso's grace, leaping across the octaves, striking the chords with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. The sound filled the vaulted ceiling, echoing off the stone walls. All around him, researchers and students stopped. They looked up from their books, their faces masks of confusion and awe. Ethan watched his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He felt a presence in his mind, a cold, heavy weight that hummed with a rhythmic intensity. It was like a second shadow, stretching out from inside his skull. The music reached a crescendo, a crashing wave of sound that vibrated in Ethan's very teeth. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, his hands went limp. He slumped over the keys, a single discordant note ringing out in the sudden silence. His breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. The smell of the library, the old paper and wax, returned, but it was tinged with something else, the smell of lavender and old tobacco. "Sir, are you all right?" The librarian was standing beside him, her hand hovering near his shoulder. Ethan looked up. His vision was swimming. "The transition is nearing its zenith," Ethan said, his voice echoing with that same Victorian weight. "The vessel is prepared for the master's return." He blinked. The fog cleared. He saw the librarian's frightened expression. He looked at the piano. I have to go," he stammered, his own voice returning, thin and panicked. He shoved past her, his heart racing. He needed to get out. He needed to find a way to stop this. The countdown on the tablet wasn't just a deadline for a surgery. It was the expiration date of his soul. He ducked into the archives in the basement, a maze of rolling shelves and dim yellow light. He needed to find the history of the Miller family, the real history, not the one printed in the annual reports. He was pulling a heavy ledger from a shelf when a shadow fell across the aisle. "Mr. Miller? Ethan Miller?" Ethan spun around. A man in a police uniform stood at the end of the row. He was burly, his uniform shirt straining at the buttons. He was cracking his knuckles, a loud, wet popping sound. "Officer Richard Moore." "I'm going to need you to come with me, son," Moore said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were hard. He reached for his belt, his hand resting not on his holster, but on his taser. "Your father is very worried about you. Says you're having some kind of mental episode." Ethan backed away, his heels clicking on the floor. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I know who pays your salary, officer. It isn't the city." Moore sighed, the sound of a man burdened by a chore. "Don't make this difficult, Ethan. It's for your own good. The Foundation has a medical team waiting." He stepped forward, the taser leaving its holster with a click. Ethan's mind raced. He looked at the ceiling. The library's fire suppression system was a modern upgrade, a series of high-pressure pipes and sensors. He knew the layout. He had audited the security for the library's digital archives 2 years ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic device, a handheld signal generator he used for testing wireless nodes. He dialed the frequency, his fingers moving with frantic speed. "Stay back," Ethan warned. Moore didn't stay back. He lunged. Ethan triggered the device. A high-pitched whine filled the room, a sound so sharp it made Moore wince and drop his taser. A second later, the overhead sensors turned red. The system detected a critical heat event that didn't exist. The ceiling erupted. A deluge of water and chemical fire suppressant mist hissed into the room. It wasn't a gentle spray. It was a torrential downpour that turned the basement into a whiteout of freezing water and fog. Moore roared in frustration, slipping on the wet floor. Ethan didn't wait. He dived between 2 rolling shelves, the cold water soaking through his jacket in seconds. He moved by touch and memory, counting the turns. Left at the genealogy section, right at the colonial records. He burst through the emergency exit, the alarm's wail vibrating through the very floor beneath his feet. He stumbled out into the gray afternoon air of 42nd Street, drenched and shivering. He needed help. He needed one person he could trust. He made his way to a secluded pier on the Hudson River, a place where the wind whipped the water into whitecaps and the smell of salt was thick enough to taste. He had messaged Chloe from a burner phone he'd picked up at a bodega. She was waiting for him at the end of the pier, her back to the city. When she turned, her face was etched with what looked like deep concern. "Ethan, my God, you're freezing," she said, rushing toward him. She reached out to touch his face, her hands warm against his chilled skin. "I've been so scared. Your father's men. They came back to the apartment. They took everything." Ethan leaned into her touch, his resolve crumbling. "Chloe, I don't know what's happening to me. I'm losing my mind. I played the piano. I don't play the piano. And the things I'm saying, it's like someone else is using my mouth." Chloe pulled him into a hug. "It's okay. We'll get away. I have a car hidden 3 blocks from here. We can go to my sister's place in Pennsylvania. They won't find us there." Ethan pulled back, looking into her blue eyes. "You'd do that? You'd leave everything?" Chloe smiled. The practiced girl-next-door smile that had always made Ethan feel like the center of the universe. "Of course, Ethan. I love you." Ethan felt a surge of relief, so intense it made his knees weak. He wasn't alone. He had a path out. He reached for her hand, ready to follow her into the dark. "Wait," Ethan said, his brow furrowing. "How did you get past the security detail at the apartment? They were still there when I left." Chloe's smile didn't falter, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes remained cold, observant, tracking the movement of a seagull behind him. "I told them I could find you," she said softly. Ethan froze. The wind seemed to die down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. "What?" Chloe reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder disguised as a keychain. She pressed a button. "Subject is experiencing stage 2 manifestation." Chloe's voice came from the speaker, flat and clinical. "Motor function override confirmed. Personality fragmentation at 40%. He is vulnerable. Requesting extraction team to Pier 54. Ethan backed away, his boots skidding on the wet wood of the pier. "Chloe, what is that?" She didn't answer him directly. She spoke into a small earpiece he hadn't noticed before. "Target is on site. Proceed with the sedative." You were one of them?" Ethan's voice was a whisper, a broken thing. "The DNA kit. You gave it to me for my birthday. You wanted me to find out." Chloe adjusted her coat, her posture shifting. The warmth was gone. She looked at him the way a scientist looks at a slide. "The kit was the trigger, Ethan. We needed to see how the consciousness would react to the realization of its own origin. It was a stress test. You passed, by the way. Your integration is ahead of schedule." Ethan looked behind her. 2 black SUVs were pulling onto the pier, their tires crunching on the gravel. "I loved you," Ethan said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "I know," Chloe said. She checked her watch, a small silver thing. That was the most successful part of the simulation. It provided the emotional anchor necessary to keep the neural pathways open. She looked at him with a flicker of something. Not regret, but perhaps a professional curiosity. "Don't be sad, Ethan. You aren't being deleted. You're being completed. The man you're becoming. He's much more important than the man you are." Ethan didn't wait for the men to exit the SUVs. He turned and sprinted toward the edge of the pier. "Ethan, don't!" Chloe shouted, her voice finally losing its calm. He didn't listen. He leapt. The water of the Hudson was a shock of liquid ice. It hammered the air from his lungs, dragging him down into the dark, silt-heavy depths. He kicked, fighting the weight of his soaked clothes, pushing himself away from the pier. He stayed under until his chest screamed, finally surfacing under the rusted shadow of an old barge. He watched from the darkness as the men searched the water with high-powered beams. He saw Chloe standing at the edge, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. She wasn't crying. She was talking into her keychain. Ethan drifted with the current, his mind a void. He had no money, no home, no family, no love. He was nothing but a biological hard drive, floating in the trash of the river. He eventually clawed his way onto a rocky bank in the industrial district, miles from the pier. He found an abandoned warehouse, a cavernous space of rusted steel and broken glass. He collapsed onto a pile of old burlap sacks, his body shaking with a chill that wouldn't leave. He pulled the stolen tablet from his inner pocket. It was waterproof, the screen still glowing with that relentless countdown. 48 hours remaining. 48, Ethan whispered. 49. 50. The counting didn't help. Inside his head, the humming began again. It was louder now, a rhythmic, hypnotic vibration that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. He closed his eyes and saw a man in a white room, counting 47 white shirts in a wardrobe. "The flesh is a prison," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. "But the word is eternal." Ethan clutched his head, screaming into the empty warehouse. The sound echoed off the corrugated metal walls, a lonely, desperate noise that was quickly swallowed by the wind. He needed to end this. If he was a system, he needed to find the source code. He needed to go to the heart of the Miller legacy. He needed to go to the Hudson Valley. The journey north was a blur of hitching rides, on the back of delivery trucks, and walking along the edges of dark highways. Ethan moved like a ghost, his eyes sunken, his jaw tight. He stole a bottle of water and a protein bar from a gas station, feeling a flicker of guilt that he quickly suppressed. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a survival protocol. As he neared the estate, the air grew colder. The Hudson Valley was shrouded in a thick gray mist that clung to the trees like a shroud. He reached the perimeter of the Miller property at dusk. The estate was surrounded by a high-tech fence, a mesh of black wire that hummed with a low-voltage current. Ethan knelt in the tall grass, watching the patrol lights sweep across the grounds. He pulled a small, handheld computer from his bag, a tool he'd built years ago for his job. He connected it to the fence's control box, his fingers moving with a mechanical efficiency that felt both familiar and alien. "Accessing the directory," he whispered. The system prompted for a biometric override. Ethan hesitated. He placed his thumb on the glass scanner. The screen flashed green. "Welcome, Administrator Silas." Ethan pulled his hand back as if the scanner had burned him. The system didn't recognize him as Ethan. It recognized the ghost. The gates hissed open. He moved through the grounds, a shadow among shadows. The manor loomed ahead, a massive Gothic structure of gray stone and dark windows. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. He found a side entrance, a heavy oak door that led to the servants' quarters. He slipped inside, the air smelling of floor wax and something metallic. He made his way to his father's study, a room he had been forbidden from entering as a child. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, and the desk was a massive slab of dark mahogany. In the corner, a projector hummed, casting a flickering image onto a silver screen. Ethan watched, frozen. It was black and white footage, grainy and scratched. A man who looked exactly like Ethan, but older, with a beard and eyes that burned with a terrifying intensity, stood before a group of people in white robes. The man, the original Silas Miller, held a silver chalice. He was speaking, his voice thin and crackling through the old speakers. "The blood is the ink," Silas said. "The body is the page. We do not die. We simply wait for a new edition." He stepped toward a young man kneeling before him. With a sudden, violent movement, Silas sliced the man's palm, letting the blood drip into the chalice. The crowd began to hum, the same funeral dirge that Ethan had played on the piano. Ethan felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't science. It wasn't even a legacy. It was a cult, a trans-generational obsession with immortality, fueled by the wealth of the Miller Empire. "It's a beautiful vision, isn't it?" Ethan spun around. Thomas Miller stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a bespoke suit, his Patek Philippe watch glinting in the light of the projector. He was straightening his tie, once, twice, 3 times. The triple tug. "Father," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Don't use that word, Ethan. It's a biological inaccuracy," Thomas said. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and predatory. "You are the culmination of 70 years of refinement, the perfect vessel for the master's return." "I'm a human being," Ethan shouted. Thomas smiled, a cold, thin line. "You are a masterpiece of engineering. Your memories, your personality, they were the packing material, necessary to keep the brain active until the primary occupant was ready." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning Ethan's face with a terrifying intensity. "And he is very ready. Can't you feel him, Ethan? The humming? The counting? He's knocking on the door." Ethan lunged at his father, his fingers clawing for Thomas's throat. But before he could reach him, a sudden blinding pain exploded in Ethan's chest. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. His lungs felt like they were filling with lead. He began to cough, a violent, racking sound that shook his entire frame. He looked down at the floor. He wasn't coughing up blood. He was expelling a thick, viscous black fluid that smelled of ozone and rot. "The transition has begun," Thomas said, looking down at him with a mixture of pride and indifference. "The old ink is being purged to make room for the new." 2 masked guards stepped from the shadows, grabbing Ethan by the arms. He tried to fight, but his limbs felt heavy, as if his bones were turning to stone. They dragged him out of the study and down a flight of stone stairs, deep into the bowels of the estate. They emerged into a subterranean laboratory that looked like a cross between a surgical suite and a cathedral. In the center of the room was a long, tilted table, surrounded by humming machines and glowing monitors. Above the table, a series of occult symbols were etched into the stone ceiling, glowing with a faint blue light. They strapped him down. The leather restraints bit into his wrists and ankles. Ethan looked up and saw Chloe entering the room. She was wearing long ceremonial robes of deep crimson. "Chloe, please," Ethan wheezed, the black fluid staining his lips. She didn't look at him. She began to calibrate the machines, her fingers moving across the touch screens with a practiced grace. "Final countdown initiated," she said, her voice echoing in the cold chamber. 60 minutes to imprinting." Thomas stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on Ethan's forehead. His touch was as cold as the stone. "Be still, Ethan," Thomas whispered. "The master is coming home." Ethan lay in the dark, the rhythmic hum of the machines merging with the hum in his head. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. 1500, 1459. He felt his consciousness slipping, the edges of his mind fraying like old silk. He saw the white room again, the 47 shirts. He felt the urge to hum the dirge. No, Ethan thought. I am a developer. I am a coder. I understand systems. He forced himself to look at the Silas presence not as a ghost, but as a recursive loop, a piece of malicious software trying to overwrite the operating system. If it was a loop, it had a pattern. It had a predictable sequence of movements. He closed his eyes and let the Silas persona take over for a moment. He felt his right hand twitch. His fingers moved in a specific way, reaching for a phantom object in his sleeve. A scalpel. The original Silas always kept a scalpel hidden in his cuff. Ethan opened his eyes. He wasn't Silas, but he had Silas's muscle memory. He used that memory to guide his hand, straining against the leather restraint. His fingers brushed against the underside of the table. There, a small, emergency release lever for the restraints, hidden for the doctor's safety. He pulled it. The wrist restraint clicked open. Ethan didn't move. He waited. He watched Chloe as she moved toward a tray of instruments. He watched Thomas, who was staring at a monitor, mesmerized by the scrolling lines of DNA. Ethan reached out and grabbed a scalpel from the tray as Chloe turned her back. He slashed the other restraints in a single, fluid motion. He lunged from the table, slamming the scalpel into the main power console of the neural link machine. A massive electrical surge erupted. Sparks showered the room like falling stars. The monitors shrieked and died. The blue light in the ceiling flickered and went out, replaced by the harsh red glow of the emergency sirens. "What are you doing?" Thomas roared, lunging for Ethan. Ethan stepped back, the scalpel held out in front of him. "The system is crashing, Thomas. I'm deleting the file." He grabbed a heavy glass vial of the imprinting serum and smashed it against the stone floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled, releasing a cloud of acrid white smoke. The laboratory began to ignite. The electrical fire spread quickly, feeding on the oxygen-rich environment and the ancient tapestries on the walls. Thomas scrambled toward the ruins of the machine, his face a mask of agony. "No, the master. We were so close." He looked at Ethan, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrible realization. "You don't understand, Ethan. I had to do this. I had to make him proud." Thomas pulled back his sleeve, revealing a series of faded barcodes on his inner arm. "I was the first attempt, version 1.0. But I was flawed. My mind was too weak to hold him. He rejected me." Thomas's voice broke, sounding like breaking glass. "I've spent my whole life trying to build a better version of myself, a version he would love." Ethan looked at the man who had raised him. He didn't see a monster. He saw a broken, discarded tool, a failed prototype driven by a lifelong inferiority complex. "He's never coming back, Thomas," Ethan said. "He's just a ghost in a machine, and the machine is burning." A massive explosion rocked the room as the primary power cells detonated. The ceiling began to groan, stone dust raining down like snow. "Go!" Chloe shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm. She wasn't wearing the robes anymore. She looked terrified. "The whole place is going up." Ethan looked at Thomas, who was sitting on the floor, cradling a broken monitor as the flames closed in. "Father," Ethan started. Thomas didn't look up. He was humming the funeral dirge. Ethan turned and ran. He and Chloe burst through the chapel doors and into the cold night air. They sprinted across the lawn, the grass wet with dew. They reached the tree line just as the manor's roof collapsed in a spectacular plume of fire and sparks. The heat was intense, even at this distance. Ethan watched as the history of the Miller family, the cult, the clones, the secrets, was consumed by the flames. He looked at Chloe. She was shivering, her face streaked with soot. "Why did you help me at the end?" Ethan asked. Chloe looked at the fire, her eyes reflecting the orange glow. "Because I realized, if they could do that to you, what would they do to me once the job was over?" She looked at him, and for the first time, her smile was gone. There was only a raw, haunting emptiness. "We're both just assets, Ethan. And the company just went bankrupt." She turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the mist without another word. Ethan stayed until the sun began to rise, the fire reduced to a smoldering heap of black stone. He felt a strange, hollow lightness in his chest. The countdown was gone. The tablet was melted. The Millers were dead. He was free. Months later, Ethan sat in a quiet diner in Seattle. The air smelled of rain and roasted coffee. He had a new name, a new job at a small software firm, a new life. He picked up his spoon and began to stir his tea. He counted the rotations. 1, 2, 3. He stopped. He looked at his reflection in the window. His hair was longer, his eyes less weary. He looked like a normal man. He felt a sudden, strange urge. A melody began to form in the back of his mind. He didn't realize he was doing it at first. It was a low, rhythmic sound, barely audible over the clatter of the diner. A slow, mournful tune from 1947. Ethan froze. His hand began to twitch, his fingers reaching for a phantom scalpel in his sleeve. He forced his hand flat on the table. He took a deep breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The melody faded. The twitch stopped. He looked back at the window. For a split second, his reflection didn't move. It stayed still, watching him with eyes that burned with a terrifying, ancient intensity. Then it blinked. Ethan picked up his tea and took a sip. It was exactly 62 degrees. A stable variable. He was free, but he was never alone. The ghost was a permanent resident in his code, a lingering bug that could never be fully deleted. And as the rain began to tap against the glass like clicking keys, Ethan Miller began to count. 4, 5, 6. He would keep counting. It was the only way to know the floor was still there.